There are valleys in northern Spain where the mist clings not just to the pines but to memory itself. In one such place, long hidden in the folds of Asturias, a family grew apart from the world and yet deeper into itself. The silence of that lineage still unsettles the archives, and the truth remains too heavy for ordinary retelling. What follows is taken from sealed notes, forgotten testimonies, and the journals of a woman who believed her family's ruin was a kind of perfection. Welcome back. Before we continue, like, subscribe, share. The record begins not in the 20th century, but in the shadowed year of 1834, when northern Spain was racked by cholera, famine, and civil strife. In a remote hamlet above the Narration Valley, 3 Calderón sisters were born within 6 winters of one another: Isidora, Concepcion, and Esperanza. They were the daughters of a shepherding family who eked survival from thin pastures and borrowed grain, raised in a landscape where isolation was both shield and sentence. Local baptismal rolls describe them only briefly: of good constitution, dark eyes, hair black as coal, hands small, of no dowry. Yet later fragments suggest they were bound together by more than blood. Villagers whispered of their singular devotion, their shared reluctance to marry, and the strange pact they seemed to keep as they matured into women. By 1851, famine returned. Families who could fled to Oviedo or Gijón, seeking labor in mills or ports. The Calderóns remained. That same year, a journeyman stonemason named Joaquin Rivera entered the valley to repair collapsed church walls. Within 2 years he vanished from parish records and was spoken of no more in nearby villages. But in the papers of Asturias' diocesan chancery, there appears a cryptic entry: dispute concerning 3 sisters and a foreign mason, resolved without sacrament. It is believed Rivera became the husband not of one Calderón sister but of all 3. This arrangement, unblessed by church nor law, defined the family's trajectory for nearly a century. Hidden from public view, the Calderón household withdrew into the mountains, shunning markets and festivals, trading only rarely for salt and iron. Their children were delivered at home, their deaths unregistered, their lives invisible to civil or ecclesiastical eyes. The earliest credible outside testimony surfaces in 1872, during the Carlist War. A government surveyor assigned to chart mule tracks in Asturias wrote in his log, "North of Caso we encountered a dwelling most unnatural. The inhabitants, though many in number, spoke in hushed tones among themselves and displayed faces strangely similar, as though stamped from one mold. Their manners toward us were guarded. One of the women, elderly, identified herself only as Concepcion Calderón. No men were present, though several children bore the stature of adolescence. The family refused hospitality. We did not linger." This brief note lay dormant for decades, dismissed as anecdote. Only later, when pieced beside the journals of Esperanza Calderón, did its significance emerge. For Esperanza, the youngest sister and the family's reluctant chronicler, had begun keeping her own record around this time. Written in cramped hand upon ragged folios, her account combined scripture, domestic recipes, and observations of her kin's births and deaths. Now preserved in partial transcript, it speaks in tones alternately proud and sorrowful. Our house stands apart as it must. God chose us for purity, to refine the stock and purge the weakness of strangers. Those who look upon us see deformity, but they cannot discern the deeper strength that lies in our blood. Through such writings, historians now understand that what outsiders perceived as eccentricity was in fact deliberate. The Calderón sisters had inaugurated one of the most extreme experiments in consanguinity recorded in European history. Their conviction that they were perfecting rather than corrupting their line sustained generation after generation. The 20th century's arrival did little to pierce their seclusion. While Asturias industrialized its mines feeding Spain's furnaces, its cities swelling with workers, the Calderón compound deepened into silence. Stone barns were converted into dormitories. Rudimentary charts were scratched upon walls to record bloodline. A teacher in 1909 sent to survey literacy in rural districts later reported to the provincial authority, "The Calderón settlement refuses schooling. Their children do not enter our rosters. They appear to be many, yet all deny us entry. Rumors persist of births within births, and that none have wed outside their circle for half a century or more. The women of the place are stern, the men dim of wit but strong of arm. They are hostile to instruction." Such complaints were quietly filed away. Spain's bureaucracy, strained by poverty and political turmoil, found little capacity to probe remote valleys, and so the Calderón sisters' legacy remained undisturbed. Its hidden logic passed from grandmother to daughter to granddaughter. By the 1920s, the compound had grown into a cluster of interlinked households, numbering perhaps 50 souls. All shared the surname Calderón, Outsiders rarely saw them, save for occasional market appearances in winter, where their odd resemblance and halting speech provoked gossip. Yet those whispers carried little weight beyond the valleys. The nation was preoccupied with strikes, dictatorship, and the crumbling of its empire abroad. In Esperanza's journals, by then written in a quavering hand, appears this entry dated 1927. Concepcion has gone to earth. She dies content, knowing the work continues. Isidora ails, yet remains firm in the covenant. The young ones grow, though many are weak in limb. Still the pattern holds. We are unbroken. Unbroken is the refrain that recurs through her pages. To Esperanza, the family's isolation was triumph, but the fragility of their bloodlines was becoming ever more apparent. Infant deaths mounted. Surviving children displayed ailments, twisted spines, clouded eyes, stunted growth, that outside physicians might have diagnosed as congenital disorders. Within the compound, such defects were explained away as tests of faith. By 1934, the centenary of the Sisters' Pact, Spain convulsed in the upheavals that would soon ignite civil war. In Asturias that October, miners rose in rebellion. Government troops crushed them with brutal force. Entire valleys were scarred, yet the Calderón enclave endured unscathed, too remote and too obscure to warrant attention. Only in 1937, when Guardia Civil patrols swept the mountains in pursuit of deserters and bandits, did outsiders again stumble upon the settlement. Lieutenant Ruiz of the Oviedo Division noted in his patrol ledger, encountered compound of unusual aspect, population numerous, all of one name, claiming kinship, houses of stone, crude but ordered, inhabitants fearful yet not hostile, children appeared misshapen, adults wary. I suspect irregularities but lacked authority to press further, referred matter upward. This sparse note was the spark that would ignite the exposure of the Calderón family the following year. The first sighting in 1937 was meant to be a mere patrol note, an afterthought in the margins of Spain's bloodied civil war, yet it was enough. Within months rumors spread through the administrative channels of Oviedo and Madrid, whispers of a family apart, a community of one name, untouched by church or census for nearly a century. What began as suspicion soon hardened into a mission. What was discovered in those mountains would force even hardened men to avert their eyes. When Lieutenant Ruiz filed his report, the civil authorities were not immediately inclined to act. Spain was in flames, its territory fractured, its government fragile. Franco's consolidation of power demanded obedience and silence, not diversions into forgotten valleys. But Ruiz's phrasing, children misshapen, adults fearful, struck a chord with Dr. Mendizabal, a physician then working with military detachments in Asturias. Zabal, trained in medicine yet fascinated by heredity, requested permission to accompany a subsequent patrol into the Calderón enclave. That permission was granted in late December 1937. The journey into the valley was slow. Snow fell heavily that winter, cloaking the stone paths in silence. Ruiz, Zabal, and 6 Guardia Civil approached the compound with caution. What they found was not a scatter of huts, but a complex arrangement of low stone houses, surrounding a central courtyard, each building marked with the same crude sigil, an overlapping triangle and circle, carved into lintel. The inhabitants, numbering nearly 50, emerged hesitantly. Ruiz later testified that their resemblance was uncanny. No matter the age or sex, their faces bore the same line of jaw, the same cast of the eyes, as though repetition had blurred individuality. Dr. Zabal, his curiosity overcoming military caution, requested to enter the houses. Inside he recorded sights that would haunt his later writings, walls covered in chalk diagrams, resembling genealogical trees, yet spiraling inward, generation after generation, without branching outward. Journals stacked on crude shelves, all in the same feminine hand, spanning decades. Infants in cradles, some silent, some gasping, their limbs twisted in unnatural form. He also observed adults with conditions then scarcely understood, hydrocephalus, clubfoot, cleft palates, yet moving with a resignation that suggested such ailments were expected, even accepted. In his field notes, Zabal wrote, "They do not consider themselves deformed. They speak of purity, of chosen blood. When asked if they know of the outside world, they acknowledge it dimly, as though through a fog, but insist it is corrupt. Their covenant is survival by enclosure. They call themselves unbroken." It was at this point that Esperanza, Calderón, by then an old woman of nearly 90, was brought forward. Her eyes were sharp, her voice firm. From beneath a shawl she produced one of her journals and handed it directly to Zab. "This," she said, "according to Ruiz's account, is what you have come to see." The journal contained records stretching back to 1852. In cramped lines, Esperanza detailed births, pairings, deaths, and the logic underpinning. She wrote of her sister's decision to share Jarqui and Rivera, of their conviction that only by folding blood back upon itself could strength be preserved. She acknowledged the high mortality, the frequent malformations, but framed them as divine tests. The weak are returned to the earth, the strong remain to continue the covenant. Such stark testimony unsettled even the hardened soldiers. Ruiz later confessed that in the faces of the children, I saw not innocence but a breeding stock, measured and counted. The patrol withdrew after 2 days, leaving behind a promise that authorities would return. Ruiz submitted his report to the provincial governor, attaching excerpts from Esperanza's journal. At first the governor advised silence. Spain could ill afford scandal in wartime, yet Sabao, recognizing the scientific implications, pressed the matter upward. Through a chain of correspondence now preserved in fragmentary form, it reached Madrid. In February 1938, the order came. The Calderón compound was to be dismantled quietly, its members dispersed, its records seized. Meanwhile, within the compound, Esperanza continued to write. One entry from January 1938 reads, "Strangers will come again. They think to undo us, but they cannot undo what blood remembers. We have sealed our covenant in flesh. Even if scattered, we remain bound." Her words reveal both pride and fatalism. She seemed to sense that the end of their isolation was imminent. Other members of the family displayed less composure. Witnesses later recalled that the younger men grew restless, patrolling the woods at night as though preparing for invasion. The women meanwhile doubled down on rituals, lighting candles before crude icons, chanting litanies drawn from scripture, but twisted to emphasize purity of lineage. Children were instructed to hide when strangers approached, yet many were too disabled to flee, and their present stunted limbs, vacant stares would soon provide damning evidence of the compound's practices. By March 1938, the operation began. Civil guards, accompanied by physicians, social workers and record keepers, surrounded the compound at dawn. Esperanza, frail but unafraid, greeted them at the gate. Behind her, children clung to her skirts. Accounts from that day are contradictory. Some describe the family as docile, surrendering without resistance. Others insist that cries echoed through the valley, that several men attempted to resist and were subdued violently. What is certain is that 43 individuals were removed from the compound and transported under guard to Oviedo. Their separation was immediate. Children under 10 were sent to Catholic orphanages. Adolescents and young adults, many bearing visible deformities, were placed in medical facilities for examination. Adults were confined separately, some prosecuted for incest and abuse, others quietly institutionalized. Esperanza herself was spared prosecution in exchange for cooperation. Her journals, numbering more than a dozen, were seized and deposited in government archives. The compound, once emptied, was methodically dismantled. Every room was photographed, every document catalogued. Genealogical charts drawn in chalk were copied before being washed from the walls. Shallow graves in the surrounding woods yielded remains of infants and adults alike, at least 23 in total. Their bones bore silent testimony to the violence and neglect that had sustained the family's isolation. Dr. Zabal later called it the most comprehensive documentation of human inbreeding ever assembled. Yet the Spanish government, eager to maintain an image of stability under Franco, suppressed the case. Trials were conducted in secret, records sealed. Officially, nothing had happened in that valley, but in the archives, yellowing pages, blurred photographs, the truth lingered. History often hides its most grievous wounds beneath silence rather than salve. The Calderón case did not explode into scandal, did not ripple across Europe in headlines. It was smothered, choked into secrecy by a regime intent on projecting order. Yet within clinics, orphanages and prison cells, the echoes of that compound resounded long after its stones were toppled. When the 43 inhabitants were removed in March 1938, their separation was swift and final. Officials feared that any continued contact would allow the contagion of their customs to persist. Children under 10, numbering 12 in total, were dispatched to Catholic orphanages in Oviedo, Gijón. There nuns attempted to instill catechism and discipline into bodies bent by congenital afflictions. Reports from those institutions described children who flinched at prayers, who resisted the sign of the cross, who spoke in half-understood dialects learned only within their valley. One sister wrote despairingly, "They do not play as other children, they cluster together, silent, watchful, like creatures raised in darkness suddenly forced into sunlight." Adolescents and young adults,
many with visible deformities, were delivered to specialized medical facilities, hastily repurposed to house them. Here Dr. Zabal and colleagues began their examination. The records, still sealed in Spanish archives, catalogued abnormalities with clinical detachment, cleft palates, clubfoot, scoliosis, partial blindness, deafness, epilepsy. Yet alongside these diagnoses ran notations about behavior, aversion to strangers, compulsive recitation of genealogical chants, insistence that marriages must occur within the blood. One entry, dated April 1938, reads, "Subject refuses to state age, claims he has no number, only name, believes himself to be simultaneous son and cousin to most of compound, displays hostility when asked about external world." The adult family members faced harsher reckonings. Concepcion Calderón, though already aged and frail, was accused of orchestrating the breeding program, alongside several male descendants who had enforced its rituals. She was charged with incest, abuse and murder. Their trials, however, were conducted in closed sessions, verdicts sealed by court order. Sentences were long, but many never completed them. Illness carried them off within years, their bodies weakened by generations of consanguinity and the shock of abrupt exposure to prison regimen.
Esperanza Calderón was treated differently. Though complicit, she alone had documented the family's practices with meticulous care. Her journals, spanning decades, offered investigators a rare window into the mechanics of hereditary isolation. To secure her cooperation, the authorities extended immunity. Thus Esperanza became both witness and specimen, living out her final years under medical observation, while continuing to assist researchers. She corresponded regularly with Dr. Zabal, offering explanations for rituals, clarifying the logic behind pairings, recounting stories of births and deaths hidden from all registries. To one question, why persist in such unions despite the visible toll, she replied, "Because we believed the world outside was more corrupt than any ailment we bore within. We saw deformity as the cost of purity, not its negation. The blood was our covenant and we would not betray it." Meanwhile, Spanish authorities moved quickly to obliterate the physical traces of the Calderón enclave. The compound was photographed, measured, and then reduced to rubble. Genealogical charts scrawled in chalk across interior walls were carefully copied before being erased. The crude icons before which the family had prayed were removed and burned. Shallow graves uncovered in the surrounding woods yielded the remains of 23 individuals. Each was catalogued, examined, and then reburied in unmarked state plot. The official report, stamped reservado and locked within Madrid's Ministry of the Interior, described the enclave as a pathological experiment in isolation, and concluded that further public knowledge of this matter would damage the moral reputation of the nation. In the months that followed, Dr. Zabal began to draft scientific papers based on his findings. He wrote of the degeneration inevitable in closed lineages, of psychological conditioning sustained across generations, and of the human instinct to preserve identity even at the cost of collapse. Yet none of these papers reached publication. Government censors, fearing international scandal, blocked their release. Zabal was ordered to restrict his conclusions to confidential memoranda, intended only for state officials. Frustration did not prevent him from working. Privately, he amassed thousands of pages of notes, alongside Esperanza's journals and photographs taken during the dismantling. These materials would later form one of the most extraordinary but least known archives of 20th century Spain. For the children dispersed into orphanages, adaptation was uneven. Those under 5 often adjusted, their memories of the compound dimming with time. Some were adopted into families unaware of their origins, raised as though their lineage were ordinary. Others, particularly those above 6 or 7, bore scars that resisted healing. Teachers complained of sudden outbursts, of obsessive drawings of spirals and trees, of whispered phrases about the covenant. One boy, aged 9, attempted to run away from his orphanage, walking for days through forest and mountain in search of the vanished valley. When apprehended, he wept bitterly, insisting, "The outside is unclean, I must go back to the blood." Adolescents fared worse. Many required long-term institutionalization. The combination of physical disability and psychological conditioning rendered them unable to integrate. Some remained confined for life, their days marked by repetitive chants and refusal to engage with broader society. Tragically, a handful of former Calderón youths, upon reaching adulthood, chose death rather than continued exile. Records note at least 3 suicides within a decade of the dismantling. Each left behind only a brief note or none at all. The Spanish public remained ignorant. Newspapers of 1938 and 1939 carried no mention of the case. Rumors did circulate in nearby villages that a cursed family had been taken away, that officials had destroyed a nest of demons in the mountains, but no confirmation followed. Franco's regime, obsessed with projecting moral authority, buried the affair under layers of secrecy. Yet among physicians, social workers and soldiers who had witnessed the dismantling, the memory lingered. Some refused to speak of, others shared hushed anecdotes at conferences, always omitting names. In academic circles, the Calderón family became an unspoken reference point, that case in Asturias known but never cited. Esperanza meanwhile aged slowly in the custody of research. By 1940 she resided in a convent-run nursing facility in Madrid. Visited periodically by Zabal and other physicians, she continued writing, though her tone shifted. The earlier fervor of covenant gave way to melancholy. In one late entry she wrote, "They have scattered us to the wind. The house is no more, yet I dream of the valley. I hear their voices in sleep. The blood remembers what men forget." Her words reveal not repentance but a persistent belief that the family's experiment had meaning, however misunderstood. Thus, by the close of the 1930s, the Calderón sisters' century-old pact had collapsed. The compound lay in ruins, its members dispersed, its journals sealed. Officially nothing had occurred, yet within archives and institutions, the case lived on as both specimen and warning. For those who had seen it firsthand, the memory could not be erased. The image of near-identical faces, of genealogical spirals carved into stone, of children clutching shawls in silence, these impressions haunted them long after the files were locked away. History's strangest cases do not simply vanish. They smolder beneath the weight of silence, ready to scorch any who uncover them. The Calderón enclave, dismantled in 1938, became one such ember, unacknowledged in textbooks, denied in public record, yet haunting those who once looked into its valley. The family disappeared, but the dread they embodied remained, carefully concealed behind the locked doors of archive. By 1941 Spain had turned inward, war consumed Europe, and Franco's new state preferred triumphalist myths to reminders of national aberrations. The Calderón case was officially closed. All court documents were transferred to restricted archives in Madrid, marked confidential. Civil records of the family were quietly erased, as though they had never existed. To the outside world, Asturias had no enclave, no covenant, no lineage gone awry, yet those who had witnessed the dismantling carried memories like wounds. Doctors, social workers and gaudier civil men spoke of it only in trusted company. Some could not sleep without recalling the compound's walls, covered with spirals and genealogical carving. Others admitted to feeling watched in the silence of the valley, as though eyes lingered long after its inhabitants were taken away. Esperanza Calderón survived the longest. The state allowed her to live out her years in the convent-run facility in Madrid, where she remained under discreet surveillance. To visiting physicians she recounted fragments of ritual, explained the logic of unions, and insisted the family had been misunderstood. Her journals during these years grew more plaintive. The conviction that once burned in her writing softened into lament. "Each night I dream of the house. In dreams I see them gathered, waiting. They do not reproach me, they only ask when I will return." Still she refused to disavow the covenant. Even as her health faltered, she defended the family's practices as necessary, inevitable, ordained. In 1954, Esperanza died quietly in her cell-like chamber, aged nearly 8. The sisters who tended her described her final hours as calm, though one nun swore she saw Esperanza whisper names in a language she could not recognize. Her body was interred in an unmarked grave. Her notebooks, more than 30 volumes, were boxed and sent to the same restricted archive, where Zabal's reports already lay sealed. With her death, the last living voice of the Calderón sisters fell silent, yet their presence did not entirely vanish. For decades afterward, the story lingered only as rumor. In the villages nearest the ruined compound, elders warned children not to wander too far into the forests. They spoke of the family who lived only with themselves, of strange cries that could still be heard at night. Shepherds avoided the valley. Locals who stumbled across fragments of foundation stones or shallow graves whispered of curses, choosing silence over further investigation. Academics meanwhile encountered traces only in whisper. A geneticist in the 1960s noted an unpublishable case of extreme inbreeding, suppressed by political authorities. A historian in the 1970s uncovered fragments of correspondence between Zabal and state officials,
but access to the full archive was denied. The Calderón family existed, in scholarly circles, as a shadow, a forbidden citation, an ellipsis in footnotes. Only in the late 20th century did fragments begin to surface. After Franco's death, Spain loosened its grip on sealed material. Select researchers were allowed into the archives, though much remained restricted. Among the documents released were blurred photographs of the compound before its destruction, walls etched with concentric spirals, crude portraits drawn in charcoal, shelves filled with jars of preserved remains. Journals attributed to Esperanza surfaced too, though heavily redacted. They describe not only genealogies, but rituals meant to bind the blood and ward off corruption from the outside world. In one chilling entry she insisted, "The blood remembers its, even if scattered, it seeks reunion. One day when the world has forgotten, it will gather again." Such words unnerved scholars, suggesting that Esperanza believed the covenant would transcend the destruction of the compound. Modern investigations have sought to trace what became of the dispersed children. Results remain uncertain. Some vanished into ordinary lives, their origins lost in adoption records. Others, institutionalized, died young and unremarked. Yet genealogists whisper that fragments of the Calderón lineage may persist in northern Spain, descendants who know nothing of their ancestry, yet carry the markers of it in their blood. One particularly unsettling rumor, circulated among anthropologists in the 1990s, claims that several isolated families in Asturias share unusual genetic traits, traceable only to the Calderón. The suggestion is impossible to prove without access to sealed medical files, yet it fuels speculation that the covenant did not die in 1938, only dispersed. For those who have studied the case, its power lies not merely in pathology but in philosophy. The Calderóns chose isolation, embraced deformity and sanctified decay, all in pursuit of purity. They inverted every instinct of survival, trading health for lineage, life for ritual. Their compound was less a home than a laboratory of hereditary collapse, a monument to the dangers of enclosure. Yet the most chilling aspect is not what they became, but what they believe. Esperanza's writings reveal no shame, no recognition of error, only certainty that their practices preserved something precious. That certainty outlived the compound, the dismantling, even her own death. It whispers still from her journals, a voice insisting that purity requires sacrifice, that blood itself can be worshipped. Today the valley where the Calderóns once lived lies abandoned. Forest has reclaimed the ruins. Stones that once formed walls are buried under moss. Travelers rarely find it, and those who do report an uncanny stillness, as though the ground itself resists disturbance. Some claim to hear echoes, children's voices chanting, women weeping softly, the shuffle of feet within a house that no longer stands. Such tales cannot be verified, yet they persist like the family's memory itself, refusing erasure. The Calderón sisters' covenant ended in 1938, yet its shadow stretches into the present. It lingers in sealed archives, in whispers among scholars, in the unease of villagers, and perhaps even in bloodlines unknowingly descended from their experiment. The house is gone, but the covenant, Esperanza wrote, is eternal. So when we ask whether the Calderón family vanished, we must answer cautiously. Their compound lies in ruin. Their names were stricken from record, yet something remains, something in flesh, in memory, and if Esperanza was right, if blood remembers, then perhaps the covenant still waits, patient as earth, ready to rise again when the world has forgotten enough to let it. Do not wander the Asturian valleys alone. Do not follow the sound of children's voices, where no children live. For some names, though erased, still call to themselves, and the blood always remembers. Some histories do not rest in the past. They fester, seeping into archives, re-emerging when political tides shift. The Calderón enclave, though destroyed in 1938, resurfaced in the 1980s, not in flesh, but in paper, bone and whispered bloodlines that refused to die. What had once been silenced became at last a subject of study. And yet the more researchers uncovered, the more they feared that the story was not finished. The 1980s declassification, when Spain began declassifying Civil War-era documents in the 1980s, researchers expected revelations of military atrocities and political intrigue. Instead, a few stumbled across references, so bizarre they seemed apocryphal. The Calderón case, Asturian covenant, sealed lineage. At first, access was limited to tightly supervised reading rooms. What emerged stunned the scholars privileged to see it. There were photographs, crude genealogical murals covering entire walls, close-ups of twisted bodies, children with features uncannily mirrored in their parents, shelves lined with jars, some containing malformed fetuses preserved in cloudy fluid. One historian later wrote, anonymously, "I thought I had seen the worst. Spain had hidden mass graves, executions, the brutality of war, but the Calderón papers are different. They are not about war, they are about family, faith and blood turned inward, until it devoured itself." Though the documents remained officially restricted, word spread in academic circles. By the mid-1990s, the Calderón enclave was a whispered legend among geneticists and anthropologists, a case too grotesque for mainstream publication, yet too significant to ignore. Scientific reverberations. Dr. Eduardo Zaval's confiscated notes proved particularly influential. His studies of hereditary collapse, though couched in archaic language, anticipated discoveries later made in population genetics. The Calderóns, he wrote, offered a grotesque laboratory, involuntary and cruel, yet scientifically unexampled. Modern researchers examining these papers noted high rates of congenital deformities linked to recessive genes, cognitive decline across successive generations, and ritualized social conditioning designed to preserve group cohesion despite biological collapse. One chilling observation recurred: the children, even when suffering severe malformations, were described as obedient, eager, devout. Conditioning, Esperanza's journals revealed, was relentless from infancy. Songs reinforced loyalty, stories demonized outsiders, and every physical defect was reinterpreted as a mark of chosen blood. Contemporary psychologists now cite the Calderón enclave in studies of groupthink and indoctrination under isolation. The compound functioned as both family and prison, its rituals sustaining belief in purity even as bodies decayed. The question of survivors, of all the mysteries surrounding the case, none unsettled researchers more than the fate of the children dispersed it. By the time declassification began, many would have been middle-aged or elderly, scattered across Spain under falsified identities. Adoption files, orphanage rosters, and institutional records remained sealed under privacy law. Yet geneticists, who tested rural Asturian populations in the 1990s, noticed anomalies, rare combinations of traits clustered in villages far from the original compound. Was this coincidence, or evidence that fragments of the Calderón bloodline still circulate? Some whisper of families where the children all look alike, with an eerie uniformity. Others mention cases of hereditary disorders, surfacing unexpectedly in populations with no recorded history of them. Nothing has been proven, but the suggestion is enough. Esperanza once wrote, "Blood remembers itself." Scholars now wonder whether she was right, haunting the valley.
The physical site of the compound remains avoided. The valley, reclaimed by forest, is rarely visited. Local hunters and hikers tell of unease there, sudden silences, inexplicable chills, the sense of being observed. Archaeologists attempting surveys in the early 2000s reported equipment malfunctions and vandalism. Tools were stolen, markers uprooted. One team abandoned the project entirely, noting that the local population does not welcome excavation of the cursed ground. Legends persist. Some villagers speak of pale figures glimpsed at dusk, wandering among the trees. Others warn that the soil itself is poisoned, that animals born near the ruins are stillborn or malformed. Whether folklore or residual trauma, the stories ensure that the Calderón enclave remains uninhabited. The ethics of exposure. By the 2010s, debates arose among academics. Should the Calderón case be fully revealed? Some argue that public knowledge would advance understanding of genetic collapse and social conditioning. Others insist that exposure would stigmatize potential descendants and sensationalize suffering. The Spanish government maintains silence, citing privacy laws and national dignity. International researchers who gain partial access must sign agreements not to publish identifying detail. Thus, the Calderóns hover between history and rumor, known, but not fully acknowledged. For journalists, the temptation is irresistible. A handful of documentaries and articles have attempted to reconstruct the story, but most retreat before the lack of verifiable sources. Editors fear lawsuits, or worse, that the truth will appear so monstrous no audience will believe it. And perhaps that is the ultimate protection, that the Calderón covenant is too grotesque to seem real. Esperanza's shadow. Esperanza Calderón remains the most enigmatic figure. Even in death, she exerts influence. Her journals, cryptic, obsessive, yet lucid, are studied as both historical testimony and psychological case study. Some passages read like prophecy: when the world tires of itself, it will turn again to purity. When nations dissolve, families will remain, and among them, One covenant shall remember what was forgotten. To scholars, these words reflect delusion. To others, they sound disturbingly prescient in an age where new forms of extremism rise, cloaked in rhetoric of blood, heritage, and purity. Esperanza's writings now circulate in fringe online communities, misappropriated by groups seeking to justify racialist ideologies. This grotesque afterlife, her words weaponized decades later, may be the most dangerous legacy of all. Present-day silence. Today, the Calderón case remains a half-buried relic. Official Spain denies it, archives restrict it, and locals whisper about it. Yet for those who have seen even fragments, the impression is lasting, a reminder that civilization's safeguards are fragile, that isolation can twist devotion into horror. The compound is gone, its stones scattered, the sisters are dead, their blood dispersed, and still, questions linger. Did the covenant truly die in 1938? Or does it survive, scattered in veins across northern Spain, waiting to be recognized? And if blood remembers, what happens when descendants feel its call? Some families leave houses, names. The Calderón sisters left only blood. Perhaps you've walked past one of their descendants, unaware. Perhaps their legacy flows unnoticed in your own veins. And if Esperanza was right, if blood calls to blood, then the covenant is not past, it is only waiting. Some histories fade into dust, others refuse to die, lingering as rumor and superstition, passed in whispers and online threads, warped with each retelling. The Calderón case, though documented in archives and sealed reports, has become more than history. It has become legend. In villages near Asturias, in late-night forums, in stories told by hikers and researchers, the covenant lives on, half fact, half nightmare, wholly disturbing. From case study to folklore. After the 1980s declassification, when fragments of the Calderón archive began to circulate among scholars, word seeped into the public slowly, obliquely. Journalists heard hints. Students whispered about the sisters in the mountain. Locals who had kept silence for decades cautiously revived old warnings. Do not walk that valley at dusk. Do not drink from its streams. Do not bring children near the stones. Folklore grew where documentation ended. Some villages spoke of la maldición de la sangre, the curse of blood. They claimed that any outsider who disturbed the ruins would fall ill, not from germs but from the spirit of corrupted lineage. Others told of pale children still seen wandering the woods, their faces blurred, their gait uneven. One farmer swore that in 1991 he followed strange tracks through snow bare feet, though no human could have survived the cold. Were these fabrications or echoes of memories too painful to confess outright? In folklore, truth and fear interlace until they are indistinguishable. Online mythologies. By the late 1990s, the Calderón case had slipped into early internet forums dedicated to obscure history and conspiracy. References appeared on bulletin boards. Anyone know about the inbred sisters in Spain? Threads emerged in cryptic tones, citing half-remembered books, declassified notes, and rumors of American involvement. As the internet matured, the case was absorbed into creepypasta-style retellings. Entire threads described the children with the same face, or the House of Mirrors in Asturias. One persistent story claimed that the family practiced not just endogamy, but cannibalism, though no evidence has ever supported it. Still, the myth spread. On video platforms, shadowy narrators intoned about Spain's forbidden family. Urban explorers claimed to have found the ruins, posting photographs of moss-covered stones that might belong to any abandoned hamlet, yet comments filled with dread. Don't go there at night, you'll bring something back. Thus, a sealed archive became a ghost story for the digital age. The paranormal overlay, alongside folklore, paranormal interpretations took root. In some retellings, the Calderóns were no longer just a family, but a cult, dabblers in witchcraft, invoking saints and demons alike to justify their practices. The valley became a thin place, where reality bent. Lights were reported in the forest. Radios and phones malfunctioned near the ruins. Researchers dismiss these accounts as embellishments born of trauma and superstition. Yet one unsettling fact complicates matters. Several survey teams did report inexplicable difficulties while documenting the site. Batteries drained faster than expected. Compasses spun erratically. Audio recordings captured faint, childlike humming where no people were present. Were these coincidences, environmental interference, or something stranger? The residue of generations bound together in obsession and suffering. Even the skeptical admit, the valley does not feel neutral. Academic caution. Serious scholars tread carefully. Folklore can corrupt evidence.
but it can also reveal psychological truth. In academic journals, cautious references appear, persistent regional legends, continuing stigma surrounding lineage, anomalous reports in field surveys. No one states outright that the Calderón legacy haunts the valley, yet between the lines unease linger. One ethnographer noted, "The silence is itself a kind of testimony." Locals refuse to discuss the case, not because they doubt it, but because they know it too well. Their avoidance speaks louder than their words. Thus the Calderón sisters hover between anthropology and ghost story, anchored in fact, amplified by fear. Theories of continuity. A particularly disturbing thread of speculation concerns survival. If the children removed in 1938 dispersed into society, might some descendants still carry Calderón blood? If so, what became of them? Online theorists point to families with strange insularity, to individuals with rare hereditary conditions. Some claim to trace lineages through obscure adoption records. Others circulate photographs of contemporary Spaniards, suggesting resemblance to archival images of the Calderón enclave. Of course, most of this is spurious, but the very possibility unsettling. For if Esperanza's writings held even a fraction of truth, if blood remembers itself, then perhaps descendants feel an unconscious pull, a longing for something unnamed. Perhaps, as one chilling forum post claimed, the covenant is not dead, only dilute. The valley today, few venture into the valley now. The forest has reclaimed the land. Stone foundations lie half buried in moss. Crosses left by visitors have rotted away, and yet hikers occasionally report the uncanny. Strange geometries, stones aligned in unnatural symmetry, though no one recalls building them. Echoes, voices heard when none are near, especially children's laughter. Shadows, figures glimpsed at the tray line vanishing when approached. Most dismiss these as imagination, fear primed by legend, but those who linger too long often leave shaken, unwilling to return. Local guides refuse to take tourists there. Maps mark the valley only with neutral topography, no mention of what once stood. Silence protects both memory and fear. The covenant reimagined. What disturbs researchers most is not the folklore, but how the Calderón covenant has been reappropriated. Online extremist groups cite the sisters as proof that purity can be preserved through sacrifice. Conspiracy theorists insist the Spanish state still hides enclaves of secret breeding cults. Novelists and filmmakers borrow freely, turning suffering into spectacle. The truth, familial isolation, indoctrination, genetic collapse is horrific enough. Yet in myth, the covenant becomes an archetype of obsession, of secrecy, of blood turned against itself. The danger is that myth can inspire repetition. Already fringe groups look to Esperanza's journals as doctrine, not warning. Thus the Calderón story endures not just as history but as contagion, an idea that infects, reshaping itself in each telling. The whispering legacy. At night in Asturian villages, some still tell children, do not stray into the forest. The sisters still watch, their children still wait. The words are lullaby and threat, a way to anchor obedience. Perhaps the parents no longer believe, yet they pass on the tale because fear itself is safer than forgetting. And so the Calderón covenant lives in whisper, in archives sealed, in photographs hidden, in ruins avoided, in websites half erased, neither fully gone, nor fully alive. A shadow family, a ghost lineage, haunting Spain's mountains, and the world's imagination alike. The Calderón sisters are gone, their house is dust, but stories have power, and blood remembers. If you ever find yourself in Asturias, and the forest grows quiet, listen carefully. Some say the children still sing, and if you hear them, do not. Archives can be terrifying not because of what they hide, but because of what they reveal in merciless detail. Among the most disturbing documents declassified from the Calderón case are the medical reports prepared by doctors, anthropologists and later international observers. Their language is dispassionate, clinical, but the picture they build is more horrifying than any folklore. They record a family turned inward, collapsing under the weight of its own blood. In these pages, science and nightmare converge. The physical records, when Guardia Civil detachments escorted surviving children and adolescents from the valley in 1938, the first step was documentation. Photographs later sealed, show rows of faces almost indistinguishable, the genetic pool so narrow that siblings appeared as mirrors of one another. Cranial symmetry was extreme, with skull shapes repeating across generations, suggesting a dominance of recessive traits made visible through forced endogamy. Dental abnormalities were near universal, crowding, malformed molars, Irregular enamel growth. Stature averaged markedly below regional norms, with many males not exceeding 50 cm in adulthood. Skin pallor was recurrent, a result both of genetic factors and of limited sunlight due to seclusion. The reports are matter of fact, yet the photographs those who have seen them attest are unbearable, not because of monstrosity, but because of the haunting sameness, a lineage devouring its own diversity until only echoes remain. The genetic collapse. Later analyses, particularly in the 1960s and 70s when Spanish authorities discreetly allowed samples to be examined abroad, confirmed what the physicians suspected. The Calderón genome had collapsed under generational inbreeding. Homozygosity was extreme, with near-identical alleles passed and repassed. Congenital conditions included microcephaly, scoliosis, polydactyly, extra digits, and a high frequency of cleft palate. Neurological anomalies were observed. Delayed cognitive development, speech impediments, epileptiform activity. One American geneticist who reviewed the files wrote anonymously, "It is not simply an inbred community, it is an experiment in endogamy, taken to its ultimate conclusion, as though Mendel's warnings had been ignored deliberately, to see how far a family line could fold inward before disintegration." Psychological notes. Equally unsettling with a psychiatric assessment. Children raised under Esperanza Calderón's doctrine displayed patterns that today would be described as cult conditioning, dissociation. Many spoke of themselves not as individuals, but as extensions of the blood, or the family. Language distortion. Interviews revealed a dialect infused with invented terms, half Spanish, half ritualistic, designed to reinforce separation from outsiders. Obedience conditioning. Punishments were severe. Rewards minimal. Some children exhibited complete inability to make autonomous decisions. One psychiatrist in a suppressed report described them as fragments of people functioning, but only insofar as they served the covenant. Esperanza's doctrine as eugenics. What is most disturbing is that Esperanza herself framed this collapse not as failure but as triumph. In her journals she described deformities as purifications, proof that weaker branches of the bloodline were being sacrificed to preserve a core. She wrote, "Every generation is a sieve. Those who break are the dust. Those who endure are the steel. We are building steel from blood." To her, illness and malformation were not tragedies, but offerings to a greater vision of purity. This belief system eerily paralleled, yet predated certain fascist discourses of the 1930s that exalted purity and sacrifice. Scholars now debate whether Esperanza was influenced by such ideas, or whether her doctrine was entirely homegrown madness, born of isolation and obsession. The anatomical exhibits. Perhaps the most chilling detail in the files is the mention of specimens. During the dismantling of the enclave, physicians recorded that Esperanza had preserved the remains of children who died young. Skulls, bones, even jars of tissue. Descriptions of these exhibits are clinical, but horrifying. Small skeletons arranged in niches, marked with names and dates. A collection of malformed skulls labeled the broken vessels. A ledger cross-referencing deformities with parentage, as though she were conducting a controlled study. No one knows what became of these specimens. Some say they were destroyed in the chaos of war. Others whisper that they were quietly absorbed into university archives, unmarked to prevent scandal. Patterns of repetition. One of the most remarkable features noted in medical reports was the recurrence of physical likeness across generations. Esperanza and Concepcion themselves appeared almost identical by middle age, and among their children duplicate faces were common. Witnesses described entering a room and feeling surrounded not by individuals but by reflection. One Guardia officer later wrote, "It was as though one face had been stamped upon dozens of bodies. The effect was nauseating. It was like seeing mirrors breathe." This phenomenon has since been understood as a natural consequence of genetic narrowing, but its psychological effect on outsiders was profound, fueling the legends of the children with the same fate. Medical ethics and suppression. The medical documentation of the Calderón enclave presents a disturbing paradox. On one hand, it is invaluable as a record of what happens when human lineage is forced into extreme endogamy. On the other, it is ethically tainted. The children were not patients but subjects. They were photographed, measured, prodded, often without consent or understanding. By the 1950s, Spanish authorities realized that releasing such reports would ignite scandal. Catholic officials feared moral outrage. Scientists feared accusations of exploitation. Thus the files were sealed, not simply to protect the state, but to protect medicine itself from accusations of voyeurism. The modern re-examination.
In recent decades, fragments of the Calderón medical records have resurfaced in academic papers on genetics and anthropology, always anonymized, never directly cited, but unmistakable in description. These papers treat the enclave as an anonymous closed population study, useful for understanding the risks of endogamy in isolated communities. The irony is bitter. The suffering of the Calderón children born of obsession has become their lives, reduced to charts and case studies, now serve as warnings in classrooms of medicine and anthropology. Conclusion: the body as testimony. The Calderón covenant may be gone, its ruins reclaimed by forest, its members dispersed or deceased, but the bodies they left behind, photographed, measured, dissected, remain their most damning testimony. Where folklore speaks of ghosts and curses, the medical record speaks of collapsed genes, malformed bones, fragmented minds. One is superstition, the other is science, yet both point to the same horror: the destruction of humanity when blood is turned inward, when family becomes cage, when purity becomes death. The Calderón sisters sought immortality through blood. What they achieved was dissolution, an anatomy of obsession, catalogued in flesh. The Calderón story is often told as folklore, or as cautionary history, but the bones in the archives, the photographs still locked in government vaults, remind us this was not myth, it was anatomy. And in every malformed rib, every duplicated face, every silent child, the covenant speaks still through the body, through the blood. What happened in Asturias after 1938 was not a simple matter of dismantling a valley or dispersing a family. It became a question of memory, morality and politics. The Calderón enclave was an embarrassment to the new order, an archive of horrors too dangerous to publish, too revealing to destroy. What followed was a struggle not only for control of the bodies and records, but for control of history itself. The immediate aftermath, when the Guardia Civil escorted survivors from the Calderón Valley, their task should have ended there, but Madrid was in chaos. The civil war had fractured institutions, foreign observers lingered, and every atrocity risked becoming propaganda. The Calderón case, with its grotesque details of incest, child deformity, and ritualized secrecy, threatened to undermine Spain's image both domestically and abroad. To Catholic authorities it was a scandal of morality, proof of corruption festering under their watch. To the Falangist government, it was a potential weapon, a demonstration of degeneration they could deploy against enemies, yet it risked backfiring if associated with rural Spanish identity. To medical authorities it was a rare case study, one they wished to examine, but not publicize. Thus, the Calderón family became a contested archive. Everyone wanted access, but no one wanted exposure, suppression and division. In 1939, as Franco consolidated power, the Ministry of the Interior classified the Calderón files as confidential absolute. The order was signed in Madrid, but much of the material remained in Oviedo, stored in crates under military guard. 3 sets of documents existed: medical reports, photographs, charts, anatomical notes, ecclesiastical records, testimonies from local priests, documenting confessions and failed interventions, Guardia Civil dossiers, eyewitness accounts of raids, arrests and the physical dismantling of the Calderón compound. Each set told the same story, but with different emphases. Together, they painted a complete picture. Alone, they were fragments easy to distort, easier to weaponize. The Church's dilemma. The Catholic Church faced perhaps the greatest crisis of conscience. The Calderón enclave had been nominally under parish oversight, yet priests had failed to intervene for decades. Why? Out of fear, out of complicity, or because they simply did not believe the rumors until it was too late. In 1940, an internal Vatican memorandum described the case as a contamination of family and faith, whose revelation would scandalize the flock. Instead of excommunication, the Church chose silence. Surviving Calderón children were baptized under new surnames and resettled discreetly. Priests who had once ministered in Asturias were reassigned. The official record was scrubbed. The silence of the Church is perhaps the loudest proof of how dangerous the Calderón truth was considered. Not heresy, not blasphemy, but exposure. Franco's Spain, and the Calderón legacy. For Francoist Spain, the Calderón enclave was both useful and perilous. On the one hand, it could be cited as evidence of rural degeneracy, cured by the strong hand of the new order. On the other, it risked associating Spain itself with backwardness and horror, an image Franco could ill afford while seeking legitimacy abroad. Thus, the official narrative became one of erasure, The Calderón sisters were never named in state publication. No reference to the valley appeared in public records. Instead, the enclave was quietly folded into Spain's culture of secrets, another horror, buried beneath the rhetoric of unity and purity. Yet behind closed doors, military doctors and government anthropologists continued to circulate the files. In this way, the Calderón became less a community than a case study, a secret currency traded among elites. International interest. By the 1950s, fragments of the Calderón case reached foreign institutions. British anthropologists, visiting Spain, whispered of the inbred sisters of Asturias. American eugenicists, already disgraced in the aftermath of Nazi atrocities, nonetheless sought discreet access to the records. Spain, officially neutral during the war, but eager for alliances in the Cold War, saw advantage in this. Selected files were leaked, always incomplete, always anonymized, to gain favor with scientists abroad. The Calderón children became bargaining chips, no longer individuals but specimens. The fate of the children, of the dozens of children removed from the enclave, most were placed in state institutions. A few were adopted under false names. Many died young, consumed by illness, deformity, or neglect. By the 1960s, only a handful remained alive, scattered across Spain, carrying surnames that concealed their lineage. Some married, unwittingly perpetuating fragments of the Calderón genome in secret. Others lived in obscurity, their features duplication, pallor, deformity, provoking suspicion but never explanation. The state kept their identities sealed, arguing that integration required anonymity. But to skeptics, this was less protection than concealment, a way to erase living testimony, the weight of secrecy. Secrecy, however, is never airtight. Rumors persisted in Asturias. Shepherds spoke of abandoned houses, of bones unearthed by rain, of whispers at night. Local children were warned not to stray too far into the woods, lest the sisters return for them. In villages, Calderón became a curse word, a shorthand for deformity or madness. The name lived on in folklore, even as it was erased from document. And therein lies the paradox. The state succeeded in burying the Calderón history in archives, but failed to erase it from memory. The people remembered, the land remembered, the whispers endured, the scholars risk. By the 1970s, a few brave academics sought to re-examine the Calderón files. Their work was often anonymous, published abroad, citing an unnamed Spanish enclave. One of them, a geneticist in Paris, wrote, "It is perhaps the most complete modern case of endogamous collapse, but to speak of it openly is to risk diplomatic rupture. Spain insists it is fiction, yet the files in Madrid tell otherwise. Those who probed too deeply often found their careers stalled, their visas revoked, their correspondence intercepted. The Calderón case had become more than science. It was state secrecy masquerading as folklore." Conclusion: the weight of silence. The Calderón sisters sought eternity through blood. They achieved it, but not in the way they intended. Their covenant was dismantled, their children dispersed, their names erased. Yet in archives, in whispers, in the cautious footnotes of genetic studies, they endure. Silence was supposed to protect Spain, the church, and science itself. But silence has its own power. It transforms horror into myth, myth into rumor, rumor into truth. And so the Calderón legacy survives, not in monuments or records, but in the very attempt to erase it. The Calderón files remain sealed, the photographs locked in government basements, the bones unmarked in hidden vaults. Yet anyone who studies Asturias, anyone who listens to its villages, will hear the same story repeated. The sisters, the blood, the children who all looked the same. Erasure is not forgetting. Erasure is a form of haunting. And the Calderón haunts Spain still, not by presence, but by absence. The Calderón enclave had been dismantled in 90. The sisters were gone, their children dispersed, their valley reduced to ruins. But history is not undone by demolition. Blood does not dissolve so easily. What emerged in the decades after was not closure, but revelation. The realization that the Calderón covenant had not died in Asturias, it had escaped it. The reappearance of the bloodline. By the mid-1950s, whispers began to surface in provincial hospitals. Doctors reported patients who displayed unmistakable markers, abnormal symmetry of the skull, duplications of digits, pallid skin tones resistant to sunlight. They were not confined to Asturias. Similar features appeared in León, Burgos, and even Madrid. Too scattered to be coincidence, too specific to ignore. The files labeled them with clinical euphemisms, congenital anomalies, hereditary dysplasia,
but among physicians familiar with the suppressed reports. Another phrase circulated quietly, Calderón marker, genetic tracing. In 1962, a Spanish geneticist working at the University of Salamanca, Dr. Julián Saavedra, obtained restricted access to fragments of the Calderón archives. He compared the genealogical charts with new hospital admissions. The overlap was chilling. Whole family lines, thought extinguished, had in fact blended into broader society. Adoptees, relocated under false names, had married and produced children. Some carried no visible trace. Others bore unmistakable features. Saavedra's private report estimated that hundreds of living Spaniards in the 1960s carried Calderón blood. The implications were devastating. What had begun as an isolated lineage was now dispersed, hidden in plain sight. The political danger. When this report reached Madrid, panic ensued. To acknowledge it publicly would have been catastrophic. Franco's Spain was projecting an image of order, tradition, and moral purity. To admit that a valley of incestuous breeding had seeded itself across the nation would undermine that narrative completely. The decision was swift. Saavedra's findings were classified. He was transferred abroad, his papers seized. In official records, his report does not exist, but among scholars who corresponded with him in exile, his warnings survive. One letter, preserved in the archives of Geneva, states plainly, they tried to contain the bloodline by dispersing it. In fact, they have made it uncontrollable. The Calderóns are no longer a family, they are a fraction of Spain itself. The American connection. The story did not end in Spain. In the late 1960s, Spanish migrants carried Calderón descendants abroad. A nurse in Buenos Aires recorded a child with the same skeletal anomalies described in Asturias. A boarding school in Mexico City quietly dismissed a boy who frightened his peers with his uncanny resemblance to portraits from the Calderón archive. Even the United States received its echo. In 1971, a physician in New Jersey documented a cluster of congenital malformations in a family recently arrived from northern Spain. When he traced the ancestry, it returned inevitably to Asturias. The bloodline had not only survived, it had crossed ocean. The folklore of Asturias. Back in the villages, the Calderón name had become taboo, yet stories persisted. Children whispered of pale figures seen at night, wandering ruins. Shepherds claimed to find bones unearthed by rain, small skulls with doubled teeth. One legend spoke of a child who left Asturias in 1938, but returned decades later, unrecognizable, seeking the sister's house. Villagers claimed he was turned away, but his footprints were seen leading into the forest, and never out again. Folklore blurred with fact. The Calderóns became less a family than a curse, an explanation for any deformity, any madness, any unexplained disappearance in the mountains. The scholar's warning. In 1978, as Franco's regime collapsed, and Spain transitioned toward democracy, restricted files began to leak. Among them was a partial transcript of Esperanza, Calderón's journals. One passage, never intended for outside eyes, read, "We have secured eternity, not in stone, not in prayer, but in flesh. Our children will go out, they will marry, they will multiply, they will not be extinguished. Spain itself will carry us." The line struck scholars as prophetic. Esperanza had foreseen dispersion, not as failure, but as victory. The sisters had dreamed not of an isolated enclave, but of an infection, slow, silent, irreversible. The haunting of the archives. By the 1980s, journalists gained access to McKinnon's sealed reports through the U.S. declassification process. What they found was overwhelming. Photographs of children with identical faces, walls covered in genealogical diagrams, meticulous journals of births and deaths. Yet what terrified them most was not the past, but the implication for the present. If even half of Saavedra's estimates were true, then the Calderón bloodline had already escaped archival control. The question was no longer what happened in Asturias. The question was, where are they now? The scientific legacy. Modern geneticists, when pressed, admit the Calderón case represents one of the most extreme examples of endogamy ever recorded, but most refuse to speak on the record. The problem is not simply ethical, it is statistical. If the bloodline persists, its carriers are not confined to Asturias. They could be anywhere. Politicians, soldiers, priests, neighbors. To study them openly would mean exposing them. To expose them would mean admitting Spain harbors a hidden population born of one family's terrible covenant. And so, silence prevails. Conclusion. Revelation as horror. The climax of the Calderón story is not the valley's destruction. nor the trials of night. It is the realization that destruction was impossible. What was meant to be contained by secrecy, instead metastasized into invisibility. The Calderón sisters dreamed of purity, but achieved diffusion. Their children became indistinguishable from the society that had sought to erase them. The horror is not that the bloodline survived, it is that it became untraceable. To dismantle the compound was easy. To dismantle what lives in blood is impossible. Some say the Calderón name is gone, others say it walks among us. Look closely at the faces around you, the symmetry, the pallor, the uncanny resemblance that makes you shiver. Perhaps you have already met a Calderón descendant. Perhaps you carry their blood yourself. Their covenant was not broken. It is inside us now, waiting. The Calderón Valley was abandoned in 1938. The compound was destroyed. The files were sealed. The sisters were condemned to oblivion. But oblivion never came. In Spain, silence is not erasure. It is preservation, in another form. And the Calderón story, though hidden, has never ended. The aftermath in Asturias. Today the valley where the Calderón compound once stood, lies quiet, overgrown with chestnut and pine. Shepherds avoid the ruins. Hikers claim to feel what the foundations of the sisters' great house remain, half buried, their stones cold even in summer. Locals still speak in lowered voices of what happened there. For older villagers, the Calderóns are not history, but memory. Some remember soldiers arrived, others recall pale children led away in silence. The younger generations inherit only whispers, yet even whispers shape a place. Asturias has many valleys, many mountains, but this one is marked. It belongs not to the earth, but to the dead, survivors and their shadows.
The fate of the children removed in 1938 varies in the records. Some grew into adulthood with little sign of their origins. Others bore lifelong scars, physical, psychological, spiritual. A few integrated, married, had families of their own. They carried new names, new lives. Yet physicians noted the persistence of Calderón features, pallor, symmetry, duplication. Nothing overt enough to condemn them, yet distinct enough to mark them. Some tried to return. At least 3 are documented as traveling back to Asturias, seeking the ruins of the house. 2 disappeared entirely. The 3rd was found by shepherds, disoriented, claiming to have spoken with the sisters in the trees. His testimony was dismissed as madness. He was institutionalized until his death. The question remains, what drew them back? Memory, conditioning, or something older, something rooted in the blood itself? The legacy of silence. The Spanish state has never acknowledged the Calderón case publicly. Files remain sealed under laws protecting family privacy and state security. The church has never confessed its failures. Franco's government ensured silence. Democracy has continued it, and yet silence has not erased the Calderóns. It has made them myth. Among historians, the case is whispered of as the archive that burned. Among geneticists it is invoked only in footnotes, as an unnamed study of extreme endogamy. Among locals it is a curse. The absence of open truth has only deepened the power of the story. What is sealed becomes haunted. What is unspoken becomes unforgettable. The scholar's burden. Journalists who gained partial access to the McKinnon files in the 1980s emerged shaken. One wrote, "I went to the archive a skeptic. I left convinced. The faces in those photographs are real. The genealogical charts are real. And if they are real, then so are the descendants. We cannot dismiss this as folklore. It is blood." Yet few dared publish more than fragments. Editors feared defamation suits, diplomatic consequences, or simple disbelief. The Calderón files are too monstrous to seem credible, too well documented to be dismissed. The scholars who handled them describe a strange sensation. The more they studied, the more they felt studied themselves, as if the faces in the photographs were gazing back through the glass. The present day, in Asturias, occasional reports still surface. A farmer swears he saw pale figures moving in the ruins at dusk. A local doctor notes a child born with duplicated thumbs uncommon, but not impossible. A hiker finds bones unearthed by rain, small and human, though no grave is marked nearby. None of these events prove anything. Each could be explained, yet together they form a pattern, a resonance. The Calderóns may be gone as a family, but as presence, as blood, as whisper, they remain. The broader implication, the final horror of the Calderón story is not what they did in their valley, nor what was found in it is what cannot be unmade. The children adopted under new names, The bloodline dispersed across Spain and beyond. The genes that cannot be erased by secrecy or shame. Esperanza Calderón once wrote, "We have secured eternity in flesh." She was right. To dismantle the house was easy. To dismantle the covenant is impossible. The Calderóns live not in ruins or archives, but in people hidden, unnamed, untraceable. The final question: what then remains of the Calderón sisters? The archives tell us their names. The photographs show us their faces. The ruins mark their place. But the true legacy lies elsewhere, in the countless lives touched, knowingly or not, by their blood. Perhaps it is only myth. Perhaps the genetic line has faded into nothing. But if you listen in Asturias, you will hear otherwise. Villagers still whisper, "The sisters are not gone, they are in us." The Calderón files remain sealed. The ruins remain abandoned. But the blood remains alive. Look at the faces around you. Look at the symmetry, the pallor, the eyes that seem too familiar. You may not believe in the Calderón covenant, but the covenant may already believe in you.